We're very honored today to have Mike Faulkender here. And Mike and I were speaking last week, and we decided rather than to have Mike give a formal speech, it might be better that I ask him a series of questions and then open it up to the audience for questions. And that's what we're going to do, and we think this format will be very good. And so I'd like to introduce Mike. He's chair of he's chair of finance at the Smith School of Business at University of Maryland. He joined in 2008. Recently, he was confirmed by the U.S. Senate as the 16th Deputy Secretary of the U.S. Treasury, a role he served through August of this year. And during that time, he also served as acting commissioner of the IRS for a couple months. By the way, you can start thinking about questions. And as Deputy Secretary, he was the department's chief operating officer, which included the responsibility for formulating and implementing the Treasury policy across the department for tax policy, financial regulation, sanctions, trade, and international development. Going back a little bit further, in the first Trump administration, Mike was an assistant secretary for economic policy at the Treasury, and in that role he was very involved in domestic and international issues. During COVID, he assisted in the CARES package, the Paycheck Protection Plan, and in January 2021, he was awarded the Alexander Hamilton Award for Distinguished Leadership, which is the highest service award granted at the Department of the Treasury. And his long-standing research is in this interaction between financial economics and public policy. And he's published in top journals and is cited in all the major journals. So Mike, absolutely welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Okay. Now, so let me just start out with the following, and it has to do with targeted tariffs versus the universal baseline tariffs. And so, in light of the oral arguments yesterday, that came out yesterday in the Supreme Court. Why don't you describe them, and in particular, describe what you think the next steps the administration is going to take?
Sure. So I think one of the legacies of President Trump is going to be that he has caused people to rethink the near uniform view of free trade as kind of the guiding principle, and recognizing that there are some externalities that perhaps need to be taken into account, particularly with regard to potential adversaries holding monopoly or near monopoly positions on the provision of critical industries. And so you look at, I look at a couple of things. Number one, during COVID, you think about the fact that our reliance for pharmaceuticals and PPE from China was a problem during COVID, that we had that reliance. You saw after the Russian invasion of Ukraine that there were some limits on our willingness, on the West's willingness to fully sanction Russia, because the extent to which Central Europe had become dependent on too much of their energy coming from Russia. And then you look at the most recent issue we've been having in the trade negotiations with China and the weaponization of magnets and critical minerals in order to try to obtain leverage. And so we really do need to recognize that if we facilitate the creation of a dependency on an adversary, that it very much can be weaponized, and we therefore should think about the strategic deployment of economic tools, tariffs being one of them, in order to alter the incentives for the creation of the infrastructure here in the United States or amongst our closest allies, in order to curtail the ability of an adversary to take advantage of that position. And so I was, in addition to the bio that Mickey gave, I was also the chief economist at the America First Policy Institute for 3 of the 4 years in between, and I was then the lead for Treasury policy for the transition team. And the way that I was always thinking about tariffs was not the ring around the country, but the strategic use of tariffs to facilitate a decoupling in these critical sectors. And so now there are tools in the toolkit that already exist and that we in fact deployed during the first term. So there are Section 232 tariffs, there are Section 301 tariffs, and so again, not to get too far into the weeds, but Congress has already, and this did come up in oral argument earlier this week, Congress has already given specific grants of tariff duty authority over to the president when there are either national security interests in a particular industry or there is essentially trade cheating going on at an individual country level. Now, in order to implement those authorities, there is then a process that the executive branch has to go through, either the Commerce Department or the U.S. Trade Representative's office, in order to demonstrate that certain conditions have been met, and then there are conditions that are put on the tariffs. Now, that's a longer process because you do have to go through a series of steps in order to be able to deploy those. And I think you have seen that, if anything, the president has been exceptionally impatient in this second term. And he also wants a lot more leverage than either 232s or 301s will provide. And so that was why there was an attempt to use the IEPA authorities. We'll still see where the court comes down on whether or not Congress actually did grant the breadth of tariff authority that the administration claimed in its numerous usages of IEPA. But you know, the secretary, I think, really gave us a guideline or guidepost for how we think about the president's use of tariffs. They accomplish essentially 3 things. Number one is the first item I talked about, which can be done with strategic tariffs, which is re-domestication of critical sectors so that we're reducing reliance. The second piece is they create that negotiating leverage. And then third, they do generate revenue. I'd say one of the challenges that we had working in the administration was it wasn't clear, like if you allocate percentages to those 3 things, it wasn't clear how much the president wanted 1 versus 2 versus 3. And so once you recognize that, for instance, if you re-domesticate all of the manufacturing, if we no longer import anything, well, then you're not getting revenue from the tariffs. And so in 1 minute, it would seem like the objective was to re-domesticate the manufacturing capacity, and then the next it would be, well, but we submitted a budget to Congress that shows that we're going to get $4 trillion in tariff revenue. So it's kind of like, which one are we focused on? And that was, I think, part of the challenge that we had, was trying to, and I think you saw this with what both Secretary Lutnick and Secretary Bessent, as well as U.S. Trade Rep Jameson Greer, would take potential deals that they were negotiating with various countries to try to figure out what in the president's mind did success look like. And so that's why there was a lot of back and forth. And you saw over time, I think there was some congening around what these deals actually were going to look like. But on the front end, I'm not sure that there was real clarity. And it was just, you had to take different options to the president and see which ones he jumped on.
So let's say the Supreme Court follows through on what its oral hearings seem to say, and to strike down the Trump administration's efforts on these broad tariffs. What will be Trump's next strategy?
Right. So what it will require is implementation of these more narrow provisions that are already in law. So as I said, there's 232s, there's 301s, and then I believe there's also Section 122 that allows for a 15% tariff for up to 150 days to address trade imbalances. I think you'll see the 122s implemented probably rather quickly, and then that will provide time for the more lengthy implementation of 232 and 301 processes. But it's still necessarily going to be narrower than where things are at right now, because we're not going to be able to say that every industry is subject to a national security concern, nor that every country is engaged in trade manipulation.
Okay, so Mike, you're a very well-trained economist. Do you think,
I'm getting set up.
do you think, do you have the expectation that the imposition of the tariffs is going to turn around and increase manufacturing jobs in the U.S.?
I think that we have seen that the U.S. labor force, the U.S. financial system, that to the extent we engage in manufacturing here in the United States, it looks very different than people's perception of it. It is not like the assembly lines of decades ago. It's not even what you see abroad. It's very automated. You know, if you think about what a factory worker is today, they are a machinist specialist who understands how to, you know, keep the automated processes going. It's very high tech, and so I don't anticipate that there is going to be a significant amount of labor that comes out of it. I think that the manufacturing facilities that are going to be built are going to be much more automated and AI structured than a lot of physical labor by individuals.
And how would President Trump respond to your answer?
It's still going to generate lots of construction jobs that he'll take credit for, and there will be some jobs that are created. I recognize he would much prefer that they be more labor intensive, but that's just, we all know that. That's not the economics of what manufacturing in the United States looks like today.
Okay, so let's turn to the Trump administration's thrust toward deregulation. Mm-hmm. Could you give us a few examples of the deregulatory thrust that you think has been positive so far, and what are the outcomes of it?
Right. So before I answer that, let me step back and say, I mentioned before that I was chief economist at AFPI. Larry Kudlow, who's the co-chair of AFPI, asked me in 2023 to write an economic plan on behalf of AFPI for an America First administration. And we ultimately decided not to publish it because, as you know, the Heritage Foundation put out their Project 2025, and it was, it became problematic for, you know, Heritage is having lots of problems right now, but one of the big missteps was putting it out and then allowing much of what it said to be mischaracterized. And so a strategic decision was that we were going to use it for, the plan that I wrote, we were going to use it for internal purposes, not publish it externally, and then it guided a fair bit of what we then crafted in terms of draft executive orders, draft transition plans that were ultimately handed over to the transition team. And the plan, and I raise it because I, in retrospect, wish that it had been out there, because it's funny to now watch the Democrats run on affordability, and we ran on affordability in '24. The plan was called Affordable Abundance. So the left is going after both of those words, and so I wish that I had publicly claimed them. I did in a couple of media outlets, but there were 6 elements to affordable abundance. Number 1, drill baby drill, unleash American energy dominance. Number 2, send power back to the people in the states through deregulation. 3, slash the inflationary spending. 4, extend pro-growth tax reform. 5, sound money, sound financial institutions. And 6, fair and reciprocal trade. And then we had, you know, we put a lot of thought into each one of those things, and so I talked about the trade piece that was more the strategic decoupling as opposed to the broad. The deregulation is all over number 1 and 2. How is it that you unlock American energy dominance? The most important thing you do there is through the regulatory environment. So everything from the tax code, where you've got green energy subsidies that flowed through the IRA, to environmental requirements. If you think about unlocking nuclear, we need to fix the permitting process, right? So it's somewhat ironic that in the 40 to 50 year existence of the Nuclear Regulatory Committee, I think they have licensed exactly 1 reactor, because they've been so focused on nuclear safety that they actually haven't been building plants. But if you think about what nuclear is going to look like in the future, it is not massive construction at a single location where you individually permit that location. It's going to be factories that create small modular reactors, which means we need to completely change the way that nuclear is regulated so that what's regulated is the process of creating the SMRs that's in the factory, not the construction of a nuclear reactor at a particular site. But we haven't updated the regs on that. I know that the Energy Department is working on that. If you think about labor laws, so there were efforts under the Biden administration, for instance, to get a lot more people filling out timesheets and being paid overtime as opposed to being salaried employees. And so those tack on additional costs. One of the things that I would point to regularly is there's the American Action Forum, which I believe is the Douglas Holtz-Eakin group, puts out a tally, and this is just based on what shows up in the Federal Register. There is this somewhat ironically named statute called the Paperwork Reduction Act, which just creates a lot more work anytime you want to do anything at the federal government. But one of the things that you have to do under that act is estimate how much compliance cost and hours these new regulations are going to have. And so if you look at just the estimates that are in the Federal Register, and then we can ask ourselves, do bureaucrats systematically underestimate or overestimate their estimate of the time that it actually takes to comply? But according to AAF, who monitors these things, under the 4 years of the Biden administration, there were, what was it? It was, I think, 300 million hours of compliance and a $1.4 trillion cost to the economy from the regulations that were put in place over that 4-year period. And business owners filling out paperwork is time not spent serving customers and innovating products. So I think a lot of the effort is, so one of the things that we were doing at AFPI is tracking every single one of those rules that came out and making a judgment on, is it going to be rescinded? Is it going to be modified, or are we going to keep it in place? And that was then handed over to the transition team to then go to the relevant departments and agencies to create a deregulatory agenda.
Okay, so let's switch over to tax policy. Okay, so part of the Trump administration's initial initiative was to extend almost fully the tax cuts of 2017. Mm-hmm. In your role, Mike, were there any provisions that you would have changed that ended out in the law? That is, did you fight for anything that kind of you lost out on the battle?
Sure. You know, the one big beautiful bill required, you know, majority in the House, majority in the Senate, and then it had to have the president's priorities in there, and so it's inherently a political document, and we have very narrow majorities in both of those. And so, you know, am I happy that the salt terrorists got a $40,000 cap on the salt deduction? No, but we can do math, right? And the fact is that there were more than 5 New York Republicans who were going to hold together as a bunch, and you had to have those votes in order to get it. So, you know, did I want to end up at $40,000? No. But that's the kind of political negotiations that you go through. You know, like I said, there are only 2 magic numbers when it comes to legislation: 218 and 51. Right? And so you've got to tolerate some of the things that most of the people in this room's training would not necessarily lead you to pursue, but are absolutely necessary because ultimately legislation is a political economy issue. It is not just an economic one. The president wanted carried interest. We couldn't get it, right? Now, one of the things that I'm very happy with that we originated at Treasury was the full deductibility of new manufacturing facility construction. So even if there may not be as many workers as some people project actually day-to-day working in those factory construction, again, are going to create jobs. And the idea that we're going to create this incentive, and it was very much coupled with the tariffs, right? So if the whole idea is we're going to put some pressure into the system to make it more expensive to import, well, at the same time, you have to make it therefore more effective to then engage in that same activity domestically. So part of that is dereg, part of that is a more secure energy supply, but also part of it is tax incentives in order to actually create that manufacturing capacity.
Okay, so here we are, the tax legislation is enacted, and everybody knows we have, persistent primary deficits. People talk about the word unsustainable. Maybe they don't think seriously about what's implicit in that term, unsustainable. But let me ask a two-part question. Does the administration care about, the current administration, does it care that the current trajectory of deficits is seemingly unsustainable? And Mike, where do you think this is leading to? And did it cause any turmoil when you were there?
Okay, so I'm curious as to your concern about the word unsustainable, because I'm actually at fault for changing the financial report of the US government. So my first week at Treasury in 2019, we were finalizing this annual report that essentially says, let's actually do accrual accounting on the US government as opposed to everything else, which is cash flow accounting, right? So the Treasury, in cooperation with OMB, does the financial report of the US government. At some point, I'll have to have Debbie tell me what she thinks of that report, because I think it's a step in the right direction. But if you go pull the report from 2018 or earlier, the executive summary read as follows. Section 1, where are we at? Section 2, where are we going? Well, we were crafting this report and we went into brief Mnuchin on it, and the projection in that year was that it's a forecast over the next 75 years. And the forecast was taking the debt to GDP ratio up to like 591% at the end of the 75 years or something like that. And Mnuchin says, well, we can't go there. That's an impossibility. You cannot have debt levels that high. Completely agree. That's why we put out this report. And he said, well, but then you can't say where we're going, because we're not going there. We can't go there. And so if you look at that report and every report that has followed, the executive summary now reads, Section 1, where are we at? Section 2, an unsustainable fiscal path. Which is why I then find it amusing when, and I of course had to do this myself a little bit, because I'm no less a hypocrite than anybody else when you take on one of these roles, is that you then have to, say how unhappy you are with the rating agencies when they downgrade you. Because at the end of the day, all they're doing is quoting your own report. But somehow you then have to distance yourself from whatever they're saying about you. But we know, okay, so then you get to the budget math. And again, nobody likes it, particularly inside the administration, when I do the budget math. But again, when I was assistant secretary, I chaired the working group on both Social Security and Medicare trustees reports, because as you may know, the Secretary of the Treasury is the managing trustee. And the fundamental problems in those programs are demographic, not economic. Okay? There are two inputs into that report that matter more than anything else. Everything else is second order. Birth rate and death rate. That's what drives it all. Okay? Once the boomers fully retire, which is going to happen by the end of this decade, right? And so a lot of people think that the baby boom was mostly in the late 40s. It actually was in the late 50s that was the biggest part of the baby boom. And those are the folks that are retiring right now. Those are the folks hitting mid-60s right now, right? let's see, once they fully retire, Social Security is 6% of GDP, Medicare plus Medicaid is 7%. And you have to add in Medicaid because a lot of people who end up in nursing homes end up having it paid by Medicaid. So there's a whole lot of, Medicaid is not just like for the working poor, a lot of it is for the retired poor who end up in nursing homes. So 6 for Social Security, 7 for Medicare plus Medicaid, 3 for interest on the debt, and then at least 3 for Pentagon spending because the world's getting riskier, not safer. Well, last time I did math, the sum of those 4 numbers is 19% of GDP, and the best we've ever had is about 19.5% of GDP, and I haven't funded the rest of government, right? So it's mathematically impossible to get our fiscal situation under control by never touching everything else. By never touching Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. You cannot get there. We are already trying to squeeze as much as possible out of everything other than those 5 things. But there's just, if you're going to have a Homeland Security Department, if you're going to have embassies around the world, if you are going to, have an agriculture department, if you're going to have law enforcement, we are going to have to spend money elsewhere. But if we've already got 19% of GDP going to those 5 things, the question then becomes, how much more revenue can we get? So where is the peak on the Laffer curve? That's the economic question. Then you have the political question. Does the political economy allow you to actually have the middle class and the upper middle class pay all that much more in taxes, right? So yes, we just extended TCJA or made it permanent, but remember even the Biden administration didn't want to raise taxes for anybody below 400,000. So there was already this consensus that the upper middle class also were not going to see tax increases. They were not going to have taxes go up. So we could maybe get another 1% of GDP out of the wealthy, but if you're taking everybody below 400,000 real in income and taking them off the table, there's not a lot more revenue to be had. We can bring in a little bit through the president's tariffs policies, but if spending can't stay in the 23, 24, 25% of GDP range, it's got to come down. And so that's why the secretary has said, in order for this to be sustainable, we have got to get deficits down to 3% of GDP. One of the challenges that he has that's very different from every other finance minister around the world is that the Office of Management and Budget is a separate office that reports directly into the president. In every other country, your lead budget officer is your finance minister. And so he's got to be the one out there selling the fiscal position of the United States. The Secretary Bessent calls himself the world's biggest bond seller. He's got to go out and sell bonds around the world while at the same time only having minimal influence on what the overall budget looks like because, he can only influence the president and director vote. He doesn't directly control it.
So where's it going? Now that you're not in the administration.
Well, look, there is not the political will to address it. I mean, first of all, I think everybody needs to understand, you cannot touch Social Security inside reconciliation. It's actually under the Budget Act that created the reconciliation process, it explicitly immunizes the Social Security Act. You cannot modify it. So for instance, even though we call it no tax on Social Security, we actually couldn't do that through reconciliation because it's explicitly off limits. It was just an increase in the standard deduction for seniors. Okay, but it's a marketing. Marketing, it's still no tax on Social Security, right? Okay. So you're going to, if you operate under the assumption that neither party is going to get 60 senators, you're going to have to fix Social Security on a bipartisan basis. But we can't even get both parties to agree that it's even a problem. The Democrats think we're going to just tax our way out of it. The Republicans think we're just going to grow our way out of it. Again, the demography piece is just too big for either one of those to fix Social Security. So then the question is going to be, what is finally going to force Congress to deal with something that they all consider the third rail and don't want to touch? It's going to be a failed bond market auction. I don't see anything else that forces it. Now, some people talk about, oh, the exhaustion of the trust funds. If you go talk to members right now, there's universal consensus. What are we going to do when the trust funds are exhausted? Are we going to let a 23% reduction in benefits go through? Because that's current law. No, they're just going to supplement it from the general fund. And so the only mechanism is going to be some kind of bond vigilante moment that forces Congress to actually touch what they don't want to touch.
Which is kind of what happened in the 1990s. Kind of.
Kind of, yeah.
Okay, so before we jump into the Fed, let me just ask you this question about stablecoin, because I know you're kind of involved in it, and Mike Bordeaux, a shadow member, has presented, he's very involved in stablecoin, and Andy. What's your assessment of cryptos and stablecoin?
Yeah. So I view stablecoins as an important evolution of the payment system. I'm still open-minded about what it looks like for retail users, but I think it has some very clear applications on the institutional side. So I remember when Facebook came calling in 2019 at Treasury to talk about Libra, and remember thinking, I don't want to be Western Union right now. And I view stablecoins as the natural evolution of what Libra was doing, because we still use correspondent banking relationships and the SWIFT messaging system to move money abroad. And as we know, that can take days. Whereas if you post a transaction on a blockchain, it can take minutes. And so as long as there is agreement on what the asset that's denominating the blockchain is going to be, then we can very quickly move money around the world. And I think that has the potential to just completely transform foreign remittances and international trade. And it was critically important, and this is what I kept telling members when we were trying to get action on the Genius Act, that we provide legislative guardrails and legislation that created the structure for what these were going to look like. Because the innovation is happening. This is the direction that payments are going. And if Congress does not act, other countries around the world are going to, and China is likely going to be one of them. And the last thing we want is to have international standard setting led by the Chinese. So it's critically important that we provide not just regulatory clarity, but that regulation is based on legislation. It was insufficient for the OCC or the Fed to come in based on their current authorities. You needed legislation in order to do a number of the things that were being done. And I would say, making a decision that these are fully reserved, providing the legislative language that says what those reserve assets can be, making sure that you apply an AML, an anti-money laundering regime to those transactions. I think all of those were critically important, and so I was very happy with, I know that Charlie Calamares had some issues with the Genius Act, but I thought we made huge strides, and I think Treasury through rulemaking is going to continue to provide some further clarity around that.
Okay, great. Okay, so now I'm going to shift gears and talk about the Federal Reserve. And I'm going to take two general issues here. One is, there's going to be a new Fed chair announced, and then you sat in on some of the early meetings where we talked about, or we touched on you know, the Fed's independence, but also the regulatory environment and how things might change. So, so let me start out with the Fed. President Trump said he might name a nominee for Fed chair. How do you handicap it, and why?
Well, so as you know, the president has asked Secretary Bessent to lead the initial screening. It's been somewhat transparent in that the secretary has stated who the top 5 candidates are right now. It'll probably get narrowed down to 2 or 3, and then the president will make the final determination. I think, and I'm very pleased to see Secretary Bessent leading on that, because I think he has given some thought and put out some pieces and remarks about things that need to happen to the Fed. And so to the extent that you have not read his piece on gain of function at the Federal Reserve, I think it's worth reading, and it very much is in line with the discussion that the panel had earlier today. Is that, and the way I describe it is, the Fed already had a difficult enough job to manage its dual mandate, but there was a perception, particularly in the Greenspan era, that it was very good at its job. That I personally point to the Bob Woodward book called Maestro as this moment where it was viewed as the Fed was kind of off by itself as the largest credibility, most competent part of the government, and Congress's instinct, of course, is, well, if you guys know what you're doing so well, let's give you more authority. And so I thought one of the biggest mistakes in Dodd-Frank was giving supervision of bank holding company to the Fed, because, and I think it came out in the panel earlier that if you're already struggling to manage employment with price stability, but then you're responsible for making sure that there's not a financial crisis, well, then that's going to create a conflict, because if you need to raise rates in order to curtail inflation, but the raising of rates is going to cause the securities that the institutions are holding to go down in value, you're therefore potentially creating you're therefore potentially creating an insolvent banking system. And, that's going to create a conflict that makes it even more difficult for them to carry out their job. Also, as they approach the zero, so part of it was Congress gave them more authority, but also part of it was that they used emergency tools during the financial crisis and then wouldn't get off of them, right? I mean, so again, if you think about quantitative easing and the Fed getting into, yield curve management, which arguably is not part of its remit, well, then you start getting into, we talk about, you guys were, we were talking earlier today about the 600 banks that are underwater. Anybody want to do a market value? Where's Charlie Calamares to tell me what the market value of the Fed is right now? So, and it's not like SVB was any more out of duration balance than the Fed. So as it expanded into arguably what are traditionally fiscal and regulatory policy domains and moved outside of solely its monetary policy piece, it is naturally going to bring upon itself more political oversight, right? So if you start taking on actions that heretofore had been done by political actors that had then oversight by Congress, if you, the Fed, start doing it, you can't then complain when you're then subject to less independence and more oversight, right? I think that's the essential gist of the Secretary's gain of function piece, is that as they expanded their remit, it inherently is going to create problems with them maintaining their independence. And so his view, and I share it, is let's get the Fed to narrow itself back to its more original function, thereby maintain its independence. And given that the secretary is leading the search for the next chair, I think that he's going to be looking for somebody who shares that perspective on the mission of the Fed. What else did you ask about the Fed?
Are you willing to handicap?
Not on video.
Okay. Fair enough. Will the prioritization be toward the Fed's dual mandate or something else?
I think that the president is ultimately going to look for somebody who shares his views on the future of the U.S. economy and the extent to which full implementation of the president's economic agenda is inherently disinflationary and therefore would be consistent with a lower interest rate environment than is currently the case. So I think alignment with the president and the secretary on that piece is probably going to be criteria number one. I would say Secretary Bessent probably puts more weight on the bank deregulatory piece than the president does. I think that the financial services modernization has been much more led by Treasury than something that I would say the president is particularly passionate about.
Okay, good. Okay, before we open it up, some of you may have questions. Before we open it up, Mike, I have the following question. Okay, so you're a well-trained economist and in finance, and you were in the first Trump administration and then this Trump administration. How do I put this? A lot of people might say, well, economic thinking is not getting a lot of weight in the current administration, or stated differently, what's been the role of sound economic analysis in the White House, and how do you think it's changed?
I would say that this term, compared to the first term, the president, I think, is more fixated on what he wants to do. So I think when he was president the first time around, he was still kind of updating himself on how the policymaking process works, getting kind of further into some of these issues that he hadn't maybe confronted when he was just a businessman. And so I would say there was a much more robust, he would probably say bureaucratic process, interagency process for kind of evaluating different policy-making decisions that would then go to the president, that the policy time with the president was, there were a lot of people invited to those meetings. He wanted to hear lots of different perspectives before making a decision. I think this time he's already done a lot of the thinking around those things. He knows where he wants to go. And so it's much less about giving the full breadth of perspectives, because I think he's already figured that out, and instead it's more, how are we going to actually implement? So I think what the policy is going to be this time has largely already been determined, and now when he brings people in, be it White House aides or cabinet secretaries, it's more, okay, this is what, I already know what we're going to do. The question now is, how do we actually implement it?
Okay. With that, anybody have any questions?
Can't imagine.
Andy.
Well, first of all, thank you. This is really awesome. I really appreciate your sharing with us so frankly. Okay, so two quick questions. First, can you hear me now?
That's better.
Oh, okay. Well, so thank you. I hope you heard that. I'm a big fan of the Financial Report of the United States. I was not familiar with it, and it's cool to hear that you were one of the architects of it. But I noticed the Federal Reserve is just essentially a footnote. And I think that could change. I think the administration could change it maybe in consultation with Congress, because under the 1921 Act, every agency, including the Fed, is supposed to contribute to the budget of the United States. I'm curious your thoughts. The other is, I'm actually a big fan of GAO. I think that they're completely, they don't advertise themselves enough, but they save trillions of dollars to taxpayers. They're the watchdog. They're like the McKinsey of the U.S. government. And the Comptroller General is retiring at the end of this year. And I haven't yet heard anything about, like, it's a 14-year term that cannot be fired by the president. In the law, the Comptroller Generals can only be removed by Congress. So it's a really monumental, important decision that'll last long beyond President Trump's term. And so, can you tell us anything about, like, is Secretary Bessent also looking into that, or others in the White House?
All right, so I worked with the Comptroller General as Deputy Secretary, so came in and we discussed some of the work that GAO was doing, looking at some of the Treasury operations. I know, for instance, that there was a lot of criticism of DOGE when we first came into office, particularly at Treasury, because they were looking at the payment system. I think what a lot of people don't understand, and partially it was on us at Treasury leadership for maybe not explaining it well enough, a lot of what they were doing was implementing GAO recommendations. So this may shock you, but when a payment file comes over to Treasury from a department or an agency, all Treasury does is process it, right? We don't really evaluate it. But what we did do, and this was a GAO recommendation implemented by DOGE, is we said, previously we would process it even if you didn't tell us which account the money was coming out of. So like the Department of Transportation would send it over, and if that particular line item on the payment file didn't have an account number, we would just charge it to the Transportation Department generically. GAO said, well, maybe one of the reasons that these departments and agencies, so many of them are failing their audits, is because they're not doing the work on the front end, that when they authorize a payment, they're saying what account it comes out of and whether it's been appropriated and how the money is being used. And so the DOGE guys, worked with the Federal Reserve of Kansas City, which is where the payments actually get processed out of, to require that there be a TAS, a Treasury account symbol, for every payment. And if it was not there, then the payment file got rejected. That was what we were doing. That was a GAO recommendation. And so, there was ultimately a briefing of members of Congress that were raising all this, hey, over what are you doing giving the 25-year-old Doge boys access to the payment system? It's like, we're implementing GAO recommendations. So yes, GAO does a fair bit of good work. I presume that the recommendation to replace would more likely come out of OMB than come out of Treasury. I don't know. I don't know that. I don't recall any conversation about being involved with a process for replacing. As you can imagine, trade deals, sanctions, tax negotiation, and replacing the Fed chair are a little higher in the president's mind than who the Comptroller General is going to be. What was the first question? Should the Federal Reserve be part of the financial report of the U.S. government? And I would say yes, and I will give credit to Debbie Lucas, who put on a conference at MIT last month where there was actually a paper presented about combining the balance sheets, and that makes a lot more sense than thinking that they are separate entities. And so there is some good work out there, not by me, but I was convinced by it and support it.
Hi, my name is Jack Krapansky, unaffiliated. What is your answer to the question an average person might have about who is the person that's responsible for dealing with persistently high prices? If the Federal Reserve doesn't have that job, who does? Is Treasury?
I'm sorry.
Who has the primary responsibility for dealing with persistently high prices? Is it, if it's not the Federal Reserve, we know that. Is Treasury's a job? Is it your job?
I'll say yes, because you're correct. The responsibility of the Fed is the growth rate of prices. It's not the level of prices. And so I would say ultimately it's the president, and the Secretary of the Treasury as Chief Economic Officer is going to be the primary advisor to the president on that issue.
There's this perception that U.S. dollar is going to continue to.
Hold-
Sorry, there's a perception that U.S. dollar will most likely continue to depreciate, either by the government's words or whatever reasons. But you start talking about baby boomers and the only ability to mutualize that risk, which is basically fulfilling that promise, is from the federal government, but we have no political will. Historically, the easiest way to do it is inflate our way through it. And to inflate our way through it, meaning we're going to print more money, meaning that, hey, we didn't break the promise, just each dollar I give you is worth less because it will cost more due to inflation.
The problem is the COLA.
That's one aspect, right? The other aspect is it seems like stablecoin, which I'm not an expert, is trying to say, well, why don't we try to make sure that somebody's paying for it? Because it really, stablecoin is, as far as I can tell, is not for the US consumer. We have plenty of payment rails. We don't need another extra way to pay. It's really for foreigners who are interested in US dollars. And then because it's a stablecoin based on US Treasury bills, it's a way for the foreigners to supplement our way to inflate our way through this thing. Can you tell us if that is one way of thinking, or it's just implied but not explicit? Thank you.
Yep. So the problem is that Congress put a cost of living adjustment into Social Security, so we cannot inflate our way out of the Social Security problem. In terms of stablecoins, yes, the Secretary has spoken on numerous occasions about how if these are adopted, and I agree with you that they are, as I mentioned, I think that their primary role is going to be foreign remittances and international trade. It actually buttresses the Genius Act and its implementation buttresses our position to maintain status as the world's reserve currency and potentially increases demand for dollar-denominated securities that are going to help maintain the strength of the dollar.
Thanks, Mikey. Tim Kuwarch from Harding Loevner. I have a question about the continuation of merger guidelines from the Biden administration. It appears like there's been very little change in policies enacted by the FTC Chair Lena Khan that restricted mergers. What you talked previously about the deregulatory environment of the Trump administration, and yet this appears to be an area where there's still heavy regulation. What's your expectation for merger guidelines for the remainder of the Trump administration?
Yeah, so I would say, in my lane, I would point to the fact that we did do the Capital One Discover merger got approved early on, and so and that had been being held up. But there is an ongoing concern about some of the technology firms being too large and a hesitancy to go too quickly to unwind some of those things because of those concerns about the tech companies. I think that my short answer is that was not really in my lane, and I'm not the right person to speak on behalf of the administration on that one. I can't imagine that the Trump administration is going to stay as restrictive as the Biden administration, but I think you've seen a greater desire to engage in industrial policy in the Trump administration this term than has historically been the case for Republicans. And so, if you look at some of the work that Orrin Cass and folks like that on the right are doing, then I could see there being a slowness with which some of those things get relaxed.
Thank you so much. Colby Smith with the New York Times. I just wanted to follow up on your thoughts on the Fed's regulatory and supervisory responsibilities. I guess I'm just curious how you think about this in practice, if they should not have those responsibilities, how you would think about, ridding the Fed of that oversight. Should there not be a vice chair for supervision? And if perhaps those functions stay within the central bank, I am curious how you think about this dividing line down the middle of this institution where its monetary responsibilities are considered independent, and yet they're on the regulatory and supervisory side, it would be something different.
Well, so let me take the last part first, because the president did sign an executive order that subjected independent agency rulemaking to the OIRA process that goes through OMB, but it explicitly exempted the monetary policy piece. And so I think you've already seen the administration create exactly that dividing line to say if you're doing monetary policy, the Fed maintains its ability to do that without any review by the Executive Office of the President through OIRA. But if you're going to engage in what looks like a regulatory activity, the way I always looked at it is if the OCC has to go through OIRA in order to promulgate a rule on bank operations, bank risk management, bank capital, why doesn't the Fed have to go through the same process? It should be subject to the same process of review to make sure that the agency that's implementing that particular rulemaking has actually done a thorough cost-benefit analysis. I don't think that we should exempt the Fed from doing it when it's doing an activity that looks a lot like what the OCC does. Again, I would prefer, you're going to have to go through legislation because it was Dodd-Frank that granted the Federal Reserve, as you said, created the vice chair for supervision and then created the authority to oversee bank holding companies. It would require legislation if you're going to take that away. And I don't know that we're going to get 60 votes to do it. But lesser than that, I think there is a very good argument to be made, and I think Vice Chair Bowman is open to this idea that the Fed's supervisory activity should not be redundant on what the FDIC and the OCC are already doing. And in fact, the statute says that. The statute says that the Fed is only supposed to come in and do things that are not already being done. And so I do think that we could get the Fed to play a much smaller role in supervision if the Fed would only come in and do the things that are incremental to the Fed rather than replicating everything.
Yeah, hi, Steve Blitz, not the New York Times. Couple things. A lot of the stuff you said about Social Security, I think offline, just remember, you said it's the birth rate, the death rate, but it's also net migration. So keep that in mind as well in terms of disinflationary policies, where the low inflation of the last 30 years up to COVID was because we were importing deflation, if not disinflation, from the rest of the world, and we put a 20% tax on that. But the question I want to ask you, I couldn't get away with not saying those two things, is this. Every state and local government in the United States has an operating budget and a capital budget. And over the years, other economists have talked about the federal government breaking its budget into, from the way it is, because you mentioned cash versus accrual. And wondering in your time at Treasury, has anybody actually thought about, because I think in thinking about the deficit and what you're borrowing for, I think at least intellectually, if not practically, if you think about running a balance on the operating side, but then you're funding the capital side, anyway, you understand where I'm going, so I'm just curious your thoughts.
So, all of us as economists think very differently about borrowing to fund investment that's going to generate future cash flows Also, just notions of incidence. So if it is future generations that are going to benefit from some infrastructure spending, then it should be those future generations who are utilizing the infrastructure rather than current taxpayers who are paying for it. Whereas borrowing probably should not be funding consumption, right? So those are kind of some general principles. The problem you get into is how much of healthcare spending, which is the driver of most of the long-term deficit problem, how much of healthcare spending are we going to call consumption versus investment? And that just seems like a really politically fraught question that no politician wants to take a stand on, which makes implementation of your suggestion dicey.
Okay.
I didn't say it wasn't the right thing to do. I'm just saying that yes. And so I think that it's much more likely for think tanks and academics to create that as opposed to the government itself doing it, because I just don't see why political leaders would want to get into that dichotomization.
It's done at the state level, it's done at the local level, and every U.S. corporation, major corporation, does it as well. So difficult, yes, but not impossible.
Okay.
I agree.
So let me stop. By the way, in 1989 and 90, Congressman Ullman from Oregon, who was head of the Ways and Means Committee, held hearings on the possibility of a capital budget. He lost the next election, and Congress has not considered it since then. So Mike, I want to thank you very, very much for answering all the questions, and you've been very, very informative, and I want to thank you on behalf of the Center for Financial Stability and the Shadow Open Market Committee that we're a great partnership now, and you've provided a lot of value added here. And my strong hunch is the IRS will not audit you based on your remarks today. Thank you very much. By the way, everybody's welcome. The next session is going to start in a few minutes. Everybody's welcome to a book on the 50-year history of the Shadow Open Market Committee. And again, Mike, thanks so much for your time.
Well, thank you for having me, and I do have to dart. It is my daughter's 16th birthday, and so I have a 3 o'clock train that I got to go grab.